Hi everyone. My presentation is about listening styles and active listening in the workplace. I chose this topic from chapter 11 because I find it to be a helpful concept to understand when transitioning out of school and into the workforce. Most of the time, communication problems at work don't necessarily happen just because people refuse to communicate. Rather, the issue seems to be that people hear the same message, but they understand it differently. Chapter 11 shows that communication is not just about what a speaker says, it's also about whether the listener actually understands the message the way it was intended. So, for the next topic, I want to talk about why listening matters at work. So, listening matters because work depends on people understanding each other. Employees need clear directions, coworkers need to coordinate, and supervisors need to catch problems early instead of after things go wrong. If people are not really listening, it can lead to confusion, repeated mistakes, frustration, and unnecessary conflict. Chapter 11 makes the point that listening is not just automatic, it's actually a skill. And according to Kluger and Itchikov in 2022, listening at work is connected to better relationships, trust, job attitudes, and overall workplace outcomes. So listening is not just polite behavior, it actually helps the workplace function better. There are certain things that can get in the way of understanding one another. Chapter 11 explains that communication can break down in more than one place. First, the message that is sent may not be the same as the message that is received. Then, even if the message is received, it may still be interpreted differently than the speaker intended. For example, I'm sure we've all sent out a text message that was read wrong by the person receiving it. It can be difficult to understand the intended tone of the sender through such simple means of communication. Some of the biggest barriers discussed in the chapter are word choice, the communication channel used, noise, nonverbal cues, and the emotional state, cognitive ability, or personal biases of the listener. For example, a short email can sound efficient to one person but rude to another. So a lot of communication problems are not always about bad intentions. Sometimes they just happen to get the message differently based on how the listener is filtering the information. One of the most interesting parts of chapter 11 for me is the idea that people do not all listen the same way. The book identifies six listening styles, and they include leisure, inclusive, stylistic, technical, empathetic, and nonconforming. So, a leisure listener pays attention when the topic is interesting. An inclusive listener focuses on the big idea, so the more general aspects of it. A stylistic listener pays attention to how something is said, while a technical listener focuses on like specific details and facts. An empathetic listener pays attention to feelings, and a non-conforming listener mostly pays attention to ideas that already fit their own beliefs. So, a non-conforming, I would see them as more like a biased listener. Um, I think this part is important because it explains why two people can hear the same conversation and still walk away with just completely different understandings of it. Chapter 11 gives a pretty good example of listening styles. So, the employee tells the supervisor that she has a temperature of 106 degrees, and then from there it shows how each of the listening styles might react differently. That example stands out because it shows that communication is not only about what is spoken, but it's also about what the listener notices. So, a technical listener may focus just on the number itself, and an empathetic listener is more likely to notice the urgency behind the message. An inclusive listener may only focus on the general point that the employee is sick, and a non-conforming listener may just reject the message altogether if it doesn't fit what they already believe. So, in many situations, the real problem is not always the message itself. The problem really is how the message gets interpreted by the listener. Before talking about active listening, I think it helps to explain why listening is hard in the first place. A lot of people are not bad listeners on purpose, just sometimes they're distracted, stressed out, or already thinking about the next thing they want to say. Other times they're dealing with an information overload or personal bias, which makes it harder to focus on the speaker. This matters because even a clear message can break down if the listener is not mentally present. In the workplace, these barriers can lead to conflict, wrong assumptions, or missed details. So, improving communication is not just about speaking clearly, it's also about recognizing what gets in the way of listening in the first place. One reason listening styles matter is because they can change how people communicate with other people. If someone is more of a leisure listener, you may need to make the message more engaging to hold their attention. If someone is an inclusive listener, they probably want the main point first instead of every small detail. A technical listener may want facts and specifics, while an empathetic listener will respond better if you acknowledge feelings and show understanding. A stylistic listener may care a lot about tone and delivery, and a nonconforming listener may need a more direct and firm message. I think this is one of the most useful parts of Chapter 11 because it shows that good communication is not one size fits all. Sometimes the message stays the same, but the way you deliver it has to change depending on the person who's hearing it. So, what should people do if they want to become better listeners? Well, in Chapter 11, it gives some practical advice, like stopping talking, letting the other person finish, focusing on what the speaker is trying to say, asking questions, using nonverbal cues, and avoiding distractions. That lines up with what researchers call active listening. So, in simpler terms, active listening means listening to understand, not just listening so that you can respond. I'm probably going to butcher this name, but Johnsteder and Christensen found in 2020 that supervisors' active empathetic listening had a positive relationship with employee work engagement. So active listening is not just a nice idea, it can actually improve how people feel and function at work. So I'd like to basically just kind of give an example of communication or listening styles in the workplace. So just imagine an employee tells a supervisor, I can finish the report, but I need help with the data section. A poor listener might only hear the first part and assume everything is fine. Someone else might focus only on the request for help and ignore the fact that the employee is still making progress. But an active listener hears both sides. So the report is moving forward. But there's also a specific issue that needs support. A better response would be something like, okay, so the report is on track, but the data section is the issue. Let's figure out what support you need. Chris Kluger and Liddy explained in 2021 that employees feel heard not just when someone listens quietly, but when the response actually matches their needs and expectations. So, this to me is what makes listening feel meaningful. So, I'd also like to make an example, just like in school. So, like as a student, I think it just makes it a little bit easier for some of us to relate to. Sometimes we hear the assignment instructions and we think we understood everything, but then we miss one detail, like whether it's the citation style, the word count, the due date. Um, and in that case, we did hear the message, but we did not fully interpret it. I know I've personally sat in class, and as the instructions are being read, I think I'm understanding everything. As soon as I get home, I sit down to start working on it and realize I have no clue what the prompt is exactly asking me to do because I missed a couple details. And that's basically the same issue Chapter 11 is talking about. The message was delivered, but something got lost in the way when we processed it. So, in class, that might affect a grade, and in the workplace, it can waste time, hurt trust, or create conflict. So, the biggest takeaways from Chapter 11 is that listening is not passive. It's an active process that's shaped by habits, emotions, bias, and skill. Another takeaway is that people do not listen the same way. It helps explain why the same message can be interpreted so differently. Last, active listening matters because it improves clarity, trust, and teamwork. So Kluger Itchikov in 2022 discussed the broad importance of listening at work. John's daughter and Christensen in 2020 connect like active empathetic listening to employee engagement, and Chris and colleagues in 2021 showed that feeling heard rather depends on whether the response actually meets the speaker's needs. So overall, better communication starts with better listening. All right, well, thank you all. That concludes my presentation. I hope you all enjoyed it. I hope you learned a lot. And I have included a list of references in case you would like to learn a little more about active listening and the different listening styles and how it affects us in the workplace, school, or just in our day-to-day lives. Again, thank you and have a great day.